Last time we drew skulls from the side and from the front. Today we're going to draw faces. We're going to lay out the drawing exactly the same way. So we'll need a cranium from the side, sketching very lightly. Half circle with a space in the middle. We put the brow ridge at 3 o'clock, drop the line of the face, create the jaw line, and end the jaw right in front of the ear hole. Eye socket, nose cavity, muzzle form. Our proportions, as before, half and half from eye level, and the mouth 1/3 of the way between the bottom of the nose and the bottom of the chin. Let's now go ahead and set up the skull from the front, trying carefully to align it with drawing of the skull from the side. This line I'm carrying over isn't eye level. It's the bottom of the cranium. We conceptualize the skull from the front as a simple circle. Very lightly place the eye sockets, touching the bottom. The nose cavity, cheekbones, the upper jaw as wide as the distance between the pupils, mouth 1/3 of the way down, jaw equal to the width of the eye sockets. going to lower this eye socket a little bit to align with the other one. We're now going to add flesh to these forms. Remember, the eye in profile has to be centered on the eye socket and below this indentation right here. We're going to draw it as a sideways V, making sure that the top half of the V extends a little closer to the front of the face than the bottom half. I'm going to include a skin fold above the eyelid. And while I'm working on these details, I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see what I'm doing. The front of the eyeball should be set back behind the lids slightly to account for the thickness of the lids. And the iris is very foreshortened from this view, slightly darkened, and the pupil closer to the upper lid than to the lower is set back towards the rear of the iris, not in front of it. The skin on the forehead, of course, is very thin. As well as the bridge of the nose. Remember though, the muzzle projects forward and the skin on the philtrum here is thick. So the nose is going to have to end level with the bottom of the cranium, right about here. What happens in between the beginning of the nose and the end of the nose is highly variable, since it depends on cartilage, not bone. But I'm going to draw a fairly straight nose. with a medium radius circle at the end, like that. The nostril is not, as many people believe, usually out in front of the philtrum there, but is rather tends to be centered above the philtrum, like this. And the ala, or wing form around the nostril, is best indicated with short series of light broken lines to define some of the plane changes and not a hard outline. The philtrum goes in a general downward direction until it gets to the line between the lips, at which place, well, until it gets to the plane change of the upper lip, at which time it cuts inward like that. This line between the lips continues usually with a slight upward motion, and then down again and up again, which is the foreshortened half of the Cupid's bow that we'll be talking about for the front view. Here's the lower lip, usually roughly a half circle form. Short space between the lower lip and the top of the chin, and the rounded form of the chin. If you seem to be running out of room for the chin, you can assume that, as many people do, you've put the line between the lips centered on the bottom part of the face instead of a third of the way down. Now we're going to draw the ear. The bottom of the ear is level with the bottom of the nose and the bottom of the base of the cranium. The lobe goes directly under the ear hole. Then we curve up and back, coming to an apex at around the same place as the top of the eyelid. Above the earlobe, covering the ear hole, is the tragus. Points towards the back of the head. This is the part of the ear that we press on when we don't want to hear what someone's saying. If we make a U-turn under the tragus, and make another bump facing it, facing the front of the head, smaller bump, that's the antitragus. From here, place your pencil at a point just above the tip of the tragus, and with a line moving towards the brow ridge, we create the leg of the helix. The helix, however, then rapidly curves around, following the form of the ear, and eventually fading into a skin fold that we can indicate with a broken line or shading. The tricky part of this drawing is the antihelix. Starting at the antitragus, simply curve up and around and disappear behind the helix, shading a little bit where they meet to indicate that overlap. Most beginner drawings of ears are flawed because this overlap is not made clear. Finally, a little bit of shadow on the antihelix, again pointing towards the back of the head, creates the form of the triangular fossa. Sometimes the fold of the cheek will slightly overlap the back of the ala, like this. Continuing from the bottom of the chin, we don't follow the line of the jaw. This is visible only as a plane change, which is usually somewhat shaded. On most individuals, we're going to go from here straight back towards the back of the neck, and then before we get to the angle of the jaw, we're going to dive down following the direction of the vertebrae like that. The back of the neck is closer to the spine than the front, but also follows its general direction. And the line of the shoulders, if we see it, is going to follow perpendicular direction, like that. The eyebrow, meanwhile, follows the general form of the orbit of the eye, just below the brow ridge. Connecting the tip of the nose to the tip of the chin creates what we call the facial angle. It's often useful to measure this angle and also to observe the relationship between this imaginary line and the lower and upper lips, which sometimes extend beyond it and other times, as in this drawing, are set back from it. Finally, I'm going to very lightly outline the form of the upper lip, create a slight shadow there, a slight shadow under the bottom lip, and a slight shadow under the nose. Sometimes we see a little bit of shadow also under the cheekbone. And also inside the inner corner of the eye. We'll start our head from the front by dividing up our eye line into 5 equal units. The first unit in the middle should be about as wide as one eye. And a little wider than this bridge of bone between the eye sockets. The next unit, the same size, will define the actual space of the eyes. And the final will extend out to the outer margin of the cranium. The inside corners of the eye are usually slightly lower than the outside corners. So let's bring them a little bit below this line. From there we go straight over, curving up only when we get close to the outside corner, like this. Because we're trying to achieve symmetry in the front view, it's useful to approach the work symmetrically, doing one step at a time on either side. The eyelid arches over the eye a fairly even curve like this. And among most Caucasian people, we find a thin sliver of lid.
You're working on, Mr. Allen.
The iris is a perfect circle, the top of which tends to be cropped by the upper eyelid, not the lower. And the pupil, of course, is another perfect circle centered exactly on the iris, which usually brings it closer again to the upper lid than to the lower. And finally, a small gland at the inside corner of the eye. As well as some shading the inside of the eye socket. The nose comes down as far as the bottom of the cranium and is as wide as the space between the eyes. A common error is to make the nose too narrow. The tip of the nose is very simple to draw. It's a soft curve near the bottom of this box. Looks like a small smile. On either side of that curve, draw the very foreshortened forms of the nostrils. We then finish the nose with curves that look a lot like parentheses, beginning directly under the nostril, curving up, and then angling in the general direction of the opposite eye, like that, and like this. Sometimes it's useful to shade the bridge of the nose. But we never want to put a hard outline there. To get the tip of the nose to project forward towards the viewer, it's essential to shade it. I'm going to put a form shadow across the bottom, a cast shadow underneath, and do a first shading overall. Then to get the tip of the nose to project, I'm just going to darken the core shadow of the tip and darken the shadow accent under the tip to bring out the reflected light under the nose. Now that I've shaded the nose, the eyes are looking very white. It's important to remember that directly under the eyelid, the iris turns black and the whites of the eyes receive a cast shadow of the lid itself, which, as you'll recall from this drawing, projects considerably out past the front of the eyeball. The line between the lips is again about a third of the way down between the nose and the bottom of the chin. And it starts the same way the nose did, with a soft curve, followed by slightly declining straight lines going down until we get near the pupils of the eyes, and then curving back up again slightly at the corners. Classical artists called this form the Cupid's bow, because if you view it sideways, it looks something like a bow used with an arrow. It's important to remember that this is not the upper margin of the upper lip, but the line where the lips meet. We're going to define the upper margin very faintly and then shade it like this. While the margin of the lower lip is going to be shown with a slightly harder line and a small cast shadow. We're going to draw the outline of the face in 3 steps. First the cheeks, which we'll think of as, again, parentheses, symmetrical, curving in at the bottom towards the angle of the jaw. Then the chin, which we might think of as a squat oval shape, centered under the mouth. And finally, the most difficult part is the jawline. Just as the jaw emerges in the skeleton from under the cheekbone, the jawline should be overlapped slightly by the curve of the cheek and appear to be coming from under it. Finally, a slight indent above the cheekbone turns into a slight swelling at the temple. We curve up and over the top of the cranium. The neck should be just a little bit less wide than the angles of the jaw. With the trapezius coming from behind, pointing in the general direction of the chin. The ear, again, is level with the top of the eye and the bottom of the nose, and is, of course, very foreshortened in this view. With the only features showing being the very front of the helix and perhaps a bit of the tragus. Remember, these drawings do not represent any particular person, but are rather based on averages that one should commit to memory before one begins attempting to draw individuals. In this way, one can observe ways that the sitter varies from these averages, being sure to capture those variations for an accurate likeness and to exaggerate them in the case of a caricature.